She walked into that dance hall with $1 silver and nowhere left to go. He stood alone in the corner, a blind cowboy no one would touch, no one would look at, no one would dare to dance with. Two outcasts, two people the world had already buried. She didn't feel sorry for him. She felt something far more dangerous. She recognized him because she knew exactly what it felt like to stand in a room full of people and be completely, utterly invisible. So she crossed that floor, took his scarred hand, and changed both their lives forever. But the blizzard was coming. The cattle baron wanted their land, and the fire that would break them hadn't been lit yet. Welcome to our channel, where every story rides the open range of the human heart. This story reminds us that the bravest thing a broken person can do is refuse to stop believing in the land, in another soul, and in themselves. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The wind coming off of the Wyoming plains didn't just blow, it shrieked. It carried the first bitter snow of 1882, a biting, frozen dust that scoured the weathered planks of the Oak Haven train station. But across the street, spilling from the frost-rimmed windows of the town hall, came an entirely different world of sound. A fiddle, reckless and warm, wove through the rhythmic, heavy thud of cowboy boots striking pine floorboards. It was the sound of a community shutting out the winter, safe and alive. Cora Vance stood alone on the dark station platform, entirely cut off from that warmth. The cold seeped easily through the thin, patched wool of her coat, but her hands were what ached the most. In her left, her numb fingers gripped a crumpled piece of paper, a foreclosure notice signed by her late husband's brother. Her second husband had succumbed to a winter fever just 3 weeks past, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debts and a tarnished name. She had been turned out of the house before the dirt on his grave had even settled. The town of Oak Haven didn't look kindly on a woman who had buried 2 husbands before her 30th birthday. They called her the Black Widow in hushed, cruel tones over the mercantile counters. It didn't matter to them that her first husband was a violent drunk who had met the wrong end of a spooked horse, or that the second was a frail man taken by the harsh prairie winter. To the townsfolk, Cora was bad luck, a walking curse. No boarding house would take her in, no shop would hire her. The snow began to stick to the frozen mud of the street, burying the wagon ruts. The train out of town wasn't coming tonight. The station master had locked the doors an hour ago. In her right hand, hidden deep in the pocket of her coat, Cora rolled a single chipped silver dollar between her thumb and forefinger. Her entire worldly fortune. She looked back at the town hall. The golden lantern light bled out into the swirling snow. Someone opened the heavy oak door and a brief burst of laughter, along with the rich smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, washed over the street before the door slammed shut again, severing the warmth. Cora's teeth began to chatter, a harsh, involuntary clicking in the dark. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It was sinking into her bones, slowing her blood. She knew the frontier well enough to know what this kind of cold did to a person if they surrendered to it. She looked down at her pocket, feeling the hard edge of the silver dollar. It could buy a meager loaf of bread tomorrow morning if she lived to see the sunrise. Or it could buy a ticket into the harvest dance tonight. She didn't want to dance. She didn't want to endure the pitying stares or the venomous whispers of the women in their fine, warm calico dresses. But she wanted to live. Cora tightened her grip on the coin, pulled her frayed collar up against the shrieking wind, and stepped off the platform, walking head-on into the light. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Haven Town Hall groaned as Cora pushed them open, shoving her weight against the wind. Instantly, the freezing howl of the prairie was replaced by a wall of suffocating heat, the frantic scrape of a fiddle, and the heavy thud of 50 pairs of boots stomping out a Virginia reel. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spilled apple cider, wet wool, and cheap rose water. To Cora's frozen lungs, the heat felt like swallowing fire. She stood in the entryway, her breath coming in ragged, visible gasps, waiting for the painful prickle of thawing blood in her fingers. She paid her single chipped silver dollar to the bored-looking clerk at the door. He took it without meeting her eyes, dropping it into a tin box with a hollow clink. Cora stepped fully into the light. She didn't bother brushing the snow from her threadbare coat. It was already melting into dark, damp patches on the faded wool. As she moved toward the edges of the room, seeking the massive stone hearth that roared at the far end, the atmosphere around her began to curdle. It started with a woman in a fine emerald-green calico dress. She glanced over her shoulder, spotted Cora, and immediately leaned into her neighbor's ear. The whisper passed down the line like a spark on a dry fuse. Eyes shifted, chins lowered. The lively stomping of the nearest dancers lost a fraction of its rhythm as people adjusted their paths, giving Cora a wide, deliberate berth. "The Black Widow is here." She didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. She had lived with that invisible brand for 3 weeks. Cora ignored them. She kept her chin level, her spine forged iron straight, and moved to the edge of the hearth. She held her numb, blue-tinged hands out toward the flames, closing her eyes as the agonizing, glorious heat began to thaw her flesh. She was alive. For tonight, she was alive. When the feeling finally returned to her extremities, she opened her eyes and turned her back to the fire, surveying the room. If she was going to survive tomorrow, she needed to find someone willing to hire a woman the whole town believed was cursed. She scanned the faces. The mercantile owner? No. His wife had practically chased Cora out of the store with a broom 2 days ago. The blacksmith? He was a kind enough man, but he had 6 mouths to feed, and no coin to spare for a widow. The wealthy cattle baron, Silas Blackwood, sat at a corner table holding court, smoking a cigar thick as a man's thumb. Cora's stomach turned at the sight of him. He was a man who took what he wanted and threw away the husks. A woman with no protection working for Blackwood would find herself paying for her keep in ways Cora refused to consider. Then the fiddle music slowed, transitioning into a hesitant waltz. The floor cleared as couples paired off. It was then that Cora saw the empty space. On the far wall, opposite the hearth, the crowd seemed to part like water around a stone. They didn't just ignore this corner. They actively avoided it, casting sideways glances filled with a mixture of pity and superstitious dread. In the center of that empty space stood a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and built like a man who spent his life wrestling the earth into submission. He wore a dark canvas coat, clean but heavily worn, and a Stetson pulled low over his brow. One large, calloused hand was wrapped around the head of a thick hickory cane. But it was his face that caught the breath in Cora's throat. A jagged, faded scar cut down the side of his jaw, a brutal testament to a past violence or a terrible accident. And beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were fixed straight ahead, staring into a middle distance that didn't exist. They were the color of river stones under winter ice, pale, clouded, and unseeing. Elias Thorne. She had heard the name spoken in town. A cavalry veteran who had bought a patch of hardscrabble land north of Oakhaven. 2 years ago, they said, a spooked horse had thrown him during a lightning storm, stealing his sight and leaving him to rot on his failing acreage. Cora watched him. The waltz continued. Men bowed to women, skirts twirled, laughter rang out. And through it all, Elias stood perfectly still. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He listened to the music, his knuckles white around his cane, enduring the isolation because he too likely just wanted to feel the warmth of the room. No one danced with him. No one spoke to him. They treated his blindness like a contagion. A sudden sharp clarity pierced through Cora's exhaustion. The women of Oakhaven looked at Elias and saw a tragedy. They saw a broken man to be pitied from a safe distance. But Cora Vance had survived a brutal, drunken husband, and she had survived the freezing starvation of a Wyoming winter. She didn't have the luxury of pity. She looked closer. She didn't look at his clouded eyes. She looked at his boots. They were scuffed, caked with fresh mud and a dusting of snow. She looked at his coat, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and the distinct, sharp scent of livestock. She looked at his hands, gripping the cane. They were not the soft hands of a man who had given up. They were thick with muscle, scarred and stained with the grease of hard labor. He is working a ranch, Cora realized, her heart picking up a steady, calculated rhythm. He is blind, and he is trying to run a ranch alone. He didn't need a nursemaid, he needed a worker, and Cora needed a roof. Before the rational, fearful part of her brain could stop her, Cora stepped away from the hearth. She moved across the floor, cutting directly through the dancing couples. She felt the eyes of the room snap toward her. The whispers flared up again, a sudden hissing like water hitting a hot stove. But she tuned them out. She stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Elias. He didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, the brim of his hat shifting. He could hear her. He could smell the damp wool of her coat and the lingering scent of the wood fire she had been standing next to. "The music is playing, Mr. Thorne," Cora said. Her voice was steady, lacking the sweet, trembling cadence the town women used. It was flat, grounded, and real. Elias went rigidly still. His clouded eyes didn't find her face, but his chin lifted. "I am aware, ma'am." His voice was a low, gravelly rumble rusted from disuse. "Yet you're holding up the wall." "The wall don't mind the company," he replied smoothly, though his grip on the cane tightened. "And it don't step on my boots. I'd ask you to excuse me, whoever you are, but I ain't in the habit of making a fool of myself for the town's amusement." "My name is Cora Vance," she said. A flicker of recognition passed over his scarred features. Even the blind man out on the ridge had heard of the Black Widow. But to his credit, he didn't pull away. "Mrs. Vance," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "I'm told the waltz requires 2 people who can see where they're stepping. I can't oblige you." "I have eyes enough for the both of us," Cora said. She didn't wait for his permission. She stepped into his personal space, reaching out and taking his left hand. Elias flinched as if burned. For a second, Cora thought he might shove her away. The tension in his arm was coiled steel. But as her fingers pressed into his palm, he froze. Cora felt it instantly. The brutal, unforgiving topography of his hands. Deep, ropey scars from barbed wire. The thick, unyielding calluses of rope burns. The grease of machinery ground deep into the whorls of his fingerprints. These were the hands of a man fighting a losing battle against the frontier day by day, entirely in the dark. Elias, in turn, felt her hand. He felt the icy chill still lingering in her knuckles. But more than that, he felt the rough, cracked skin of her palms. He felt the calluses on her trigger finger and the heel of her hand. Scars not from needlework, but from chopping wood, hauling water, and surviving. He didn't pull away. Slowly, hesitantly, his large hand closed around hers. "Lead, then, Mrs. Vance," he murmured. Cora guided his right hand to her waist. It rested there, heavy and warm through her damp coat. She stepped backward, pulling him gently into the rhythm of the waltz. Elias stumbled on the first step, his boot hitting hers. A few snickers echoed from a nearby table. Elias's jaw locked. He moved to pull away. "Don't," Cora ordered quietly, her grip tightening on his hand. "Listen to the fiddle. Step when I pull. 2 steps forward, 1 turn to the left. I won't let you hit anything." He hesitated, then surrendered a fraction of his weight to her lead. They moved. It wasn't graceful, it was stiff, methodical, and entirely unromantic. It was a negotiation of space and survival. Cora kept her eyes locked on his chest, guiding him around the swirling couples, her grip firm and uncompromising. "You didn't ask me to dance because you liked the tune, Mrs. Vance," Elias said quietly over the music, his breath brushing the top of her head. "And you didn't ask out of pity. Your hands are too hard for pity. You're an observant man. A blind man learns to read what people don't say. What do you want?" The waltz ended. The fiddle scraped to a halt. The room broke into scattered applause, though none of it was directed at them. Cora stopped moving. She didn't let go of his hand. She looked up at his scarred face, the clouded eyes that stared blankly over her shoulder. "I see you walking alone, Mr. Thorne," Cora said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper meant only for him. "Your hands tell me you're working a spread. Your boots tell me you're doing it in the mud, which means your fences are failing and you can't find your tools in the snow. You're going to lose your land before the spring thaw because a blind man cannot fight the winter alone." Elias's face darkened. Anger, hot and proud, flashed across his features. He tried to pull his hand back, but Cora held on with shocking strength. "Let go of me, widow." "I am out of money, Mr. Thorne," Cora said, her voice cracking for the first time, laying her raw desperation bare. "I have no home, and this town will let me freeze to death on the station platform by midnight. I don't want your charity. I want a trade." Elias stopped struggling. The anger in his posture slowly morphed into a wary, tense stillness. "What trade?" "You need a pair of eyes to keep your ranch from falling apart," Cora said, her gaze burning into his unseeing eyes. "And I need a roof to keep from dying. Take me to your ranch. I will be your eyes. I will be your hands when yours are full. In exchange, you give me a bed by the stove and 3 meals a day. No pity, no handouts. Just a deal." The room around them buzzed with gossip, but between Elias and Cora the silence was absolute. He stood there, his chest rising and falling beneath his canvas coat. He was evaluating the weight of her desperation against the weight of his own pride. Finally, Elias Thorne gave a single curt nod. "Fetch your things, Mrs. Vance," he said, turning blindly toward the door, his cane finding the floorboards. "We ride out in 10 minutes." The wagon ride to the shattered pine was a masterclass in endurance. Cora sat on the hard wooden bench beside Elias, the icy wind tearing at her face. The snow had thickened, falling in heavy wet sheets that obscured the trail. But Elias didn't need to see the trail. He held the leather reins with a relaxed, intuitive grip, his head tilted slightly to the side, listening. He navigated the 5-mile trek entirely by the sound of the draft horse's hooves, the hollow thunk over the wooden bridge, the soft crunch of snow over the meadow, the shift in the wind that told him they had passed the tree line. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The deal was struck. When the wagon finally lurched to a halt, Cora squinted through the driving snow. The shattered pine was aptly named. It was a sprawling, melancholic acreage that looked as though it were slowly being swallowed by the earth. A sagging barn leaned dangerously to the left. The corral fences were a jagged mess of split rails and rusted wire. The cabin itself was small, built of heavy, dark logs. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. It was as cold and dead as a tomb. Elias stepped down from the wagon, his boots hitting the snow with practiced certainty. "Unhitch the horse," he ordered, his voice carrying over the wind. "Lead him to the 3rd stall in the barn. The hay is on the left wall, 3 paces in. Don't move the pitchfork. Leave it exactly where it is." "Understood," Cora said. She worked quickly, her hands aching as she unbuckled the frozen leather harnesses. By the time she finished bedding down the horse and pushed her way into the cabin, Elias had already managed to spark a fire in the cast-iron stove. The interior of the cabin was fiercely austere. There were no curtains, no rugs, no feminine touches. Just a heavy wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, a wash basin, and a cot pushed against the far wall. Everything was placed with mathematical precision. Elias stood by the stove, rubbing his hands together. "The cot is yours," he said without turning around. "I sleep in the loft. There's a rifle above the door. It's loaded. Bacon and beans are in the root cellar under the floorboards." He finally turned, facing her general direction. "I wake before the sun. If you can't keep up, I'll drive you back to town on Sunday." "I'll keep up," Cora said, shedding her wet coat and hanging it on a peg near the fire. The next 3 days set the rhythm of their strange, pragmatic pact. It was a brutal, exhausting existence, stripped of all romance or softness. Cora learned quickly that to survive in Elias's world, she had to abandon her own way of seeing. The first morning, she had tried to tell him that the sky was a bruised purple and a storm was coming. He had cut her off. "I don't care about the color of the sky, Cora. I care about the wind. Is it coming from the north or the east? Are the cattle bunching up by the tree line or drifting open?" She learned to speak his language. She became his tactical observer. She described the world in structural facts, in distances, in tension. "The fence post on the south ridge is rotted through at the base," she would say over a breakfast of bitter black coffee. "The wire is sagging for about 20 yards. It won't hold the herd if they press it." Elias would nod, his face an unreadable mask. "Bring the heavy maul and the wire stretchers. We walk out after we feed the horses." She watched him work, a silent awe growing beneath her exhaustion. Elias in the dark was a force of nature. When he swung an axe, he didn't aim with his eyes. He tapped the wood once with the blade, feeling the grain and the resonance, stepped back, and brought the steel down with devastating perfect accuracy. He knew his land by the smell of the soil and the sound of the brush against his canvas pants. But for all his mastery, he was failing. There was simply too much work for a man who had to spend half his time orienting himself in space. That was where Cora stepped in. She became the silent extension of his will. She placed his tools directly into his palm before he had to blindly reach for them. She guided his hands to the exact spot where a nail needed to be driven. She set his coffee cup on the left side of the table, exactly 2 inches from the edge, every single time. They worked side by side in a silence that was heavy, yet surprisingly devoid of the suffocating judgment of the town. Elias didn't care about her past. He didn't care about the dead husbands or the rumors. He only cared that when he reached for the hammer was there. On the 4th afternoon, the sky turned a brutal leaden gray. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of ice. "The barn roof," Elias said, pausing in the middle of the yard, his head tilted toward the sky. "The shingles over the hayloft. You said they were lifting." "3 rows are peeling back," Cora confirmed, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a dirt-smudged wrist. "If it snows heavy tonight, the moisture will get into the winter feed. It'll rot. Get the ladder and the tin patches." 10 minutes later, Cora was 20 feet in the air, perched precariously on the slanted, icy pitch of the barn roof. Elias stood on the ladder below her, his waist level with the roof line. He was passing up the tin patches and the heavy iron nails, while Cora swung the hammer. It was miserable, bone-chilling work. The wind battered them, trying to tear them off the roof. Cora's hands were so numb she could barely feel the wooden handle of the hammer. "Hold the tin flat against the grain," Elias shouted over the wind, handing up another nail. His face was set in grim lines of concentration. He was tracking her movements entirely by the sound of her shifting weight on the shingles. "Drive it deep on the top corners first, so the wind doesn't catch it." "I know how to roof, Elias," Cora snapped, frustration and cold making her temper flare. She reached down to take the nail from his outstretched, scarred fingers. As she shifted her weight, disaster struck. A patch of black ice hidden beneath a dusting of snow gave way under the worn heel of her boot. Cora's foot shot out from under her. A sharp, involuntary gasp tore from her throat as gravity seized her. The hammer flew from her hand, clattering wildly down the shingles. She slid, the rough wood tearing at her skirt, her fingernails scrabbling uselessly against the ice, finding no purchase. She was going over the edge, a 20-foot drop to the frozen earth below. She didn't have time to scream. Below her, Elias didn't see her fall. But he heard the sharp, sudden intake of her breath. He heard the scrape of her boot heel slipping, the frantic rustle of heavy wool sliding down the incline. His mind, trained by 2 years of darkness to map the world in milliseconds, calculated the trajectory of the sound. He didn't think. He reacted. Elias dropped the tin patch. He let go of the ladder with both hands, relying entirely on his core balance, and lunged upward over the roofline, his massive arms spreading wide into the empty air, aiming for the center of the rushing sound. Cora fell off the edge of the roof. She braced for the shattering impact of the frozen ground. Instead, she slammed into a wall of solid, unyielding muscle. Elias caught her midair. His thick arms wrapped around her waist with the crushing force of a steel vise, absorbing her momentum. The impact knocked the breath from both of them, sending the wooden ladder shuddering violently against the barn wall. Elias grunted in pain as her boots kicked his shins, but his grip did not falter for a fraction of a second. He pinned her tight against his chest, holding them both steady on the trembling ladder in the howling wind. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Cora hung suspended, her feet dangling over the abyss, her face pressed hard into the rough canvas of Elias's coat. Beneath the layers of wool and leather, she could feel his heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, thunderous rhythm that matched her own. The smell of him, pine resin, sweat, and cold iron, filled her senses, completely overpowering the icy wind. She was acutely, shockingly aware of his physical power. He was holding her entire body weight with one arm while gripping the ladder rung with the other, his muscles trembling slightly under the immense strain. Elias's breathing was ragged. His face was buried in the crown of her hair. For a split second, Cora felt his jaw clench, felt his arm tighten protectively around her waist, pulling her flush against him as if terrified she would slip away again. In the blinding darkness of his world, he had reached out into the void, and he had saved her. The pragmatic, cold distance they had maintained for 3 days evaporated in the heat of that shared, desperate heartbeat. "Elias," Cora breathed, her voice shaking. The sound of his name seemed to break the spell. The fierce, protective grip instantly loosened, replaced by the rigid tension of a man remembering his boundaries. Elias cleared his throat, his jaw setting back into its familiar stony lines. He carefully lowered her, guiding her boots until they found the solid wood of the ladder rung below him. "Watch your footing, Cora," he said. His voice was harsh, a little too loud, completely stripped of the terrifying vulnerability of the moment before. He stepped down one rung, giving her space, his blind eyes staring past her into the storm. "Ice sets quick on the north side." Cora gripped the ladder, her knees weak, her heart still threatening to crack her ribs. She looked at his scarred profile, seeing the tight, defensive set of his shoulders. He was retreating back into his fortress of isolation. "I have my footing," Cora said softly, though her hands were still shaking. "Good," Elias said curtly. He began his methodical, careful descent down the ladder. "Leave the rest. The storm is breaking. We're done for the day." Cora watched his broad back as he descended into the swirling snow. They had survived the fall. They had returned to the dry bargain of their pact. But as she followed him down into the cold, Cora knew something fundamental had cracked. The stranger's hand hadn't just reached through the silence. It had pulled her back from the edge, and the ghost of his heartbeat still pounded against her own. The sound was faint, carrying over 3 miles of frozen prairie, but to Elias Thorne, it might as well have been a gunshot in the bedroom. Snap, whiplash, thud. Elias sat bolt upright in the loft, the heavy wool blankets pooling at his waist. The cabin was pitch black, the fire in the iron stove having died down to mere embers, but the darkness meant nothing to him. He tilted his head toward the north wall, his breath frosting in the frigid air. He waited, his pulse thrumming a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. Another sound followed, a high, frantic yelp that cut off far too quickly. "Cora!" His voice was a low, gravelly bark that cut through the silence of the cabin. Below him, the canvas cot creaked violently. Cora was a light sleeper, a habit forged by years of sleeping with one eye open in a violent household. She didn't ask questions. Elias heard the rustle of her heavy skirts, the scrape of a match, and the sudden hiss of the kerosene lantern catching light. "I'm awake." Her voice drifted up, tight and clear. "What is it?" "Get your boots on. Heavy coat. We're riding out to the North Ridge." Elias was already moving, his calloused hands finding his canvas trousers and leather suspenders with practiced blind efficiency. "It's 2 hours till dawn, Elias. The snow is knee-deep." "Someone just cut the perimeter wire on the north pasture," he said, descending the wooden ladder by feel, his boots hitting the floorboards with heavy finality. He reached for his gun belt hanging on the peg by the door, his thumb brushing the cold iron of the Colt revolver. and Blue just stopped barking. The tension in the cabin immediately thickened. Blue was the Shattered Pines' lone cowdog, an aging but fiercely loyal blue heeler that slept out with the small herd of breeding heifers. Cora didn't argue. She shoved her feet into her stiff boots and grabbed her coat. "I'll saddle the horses." The ride to the North Ridge was agonizingly slow. The snow was a blinding, swirling curtain of white under the pale moonlight. Cora rode a half-length ahead on the bay mare, guiding Elias's gray gelding through the deepest drifts. Elias rode in absolute silence, his jaw locked, his head turning constantly, mapping the landscape through the howl of the wind. "Stop," Elias commanded suddenly, pulling back on his reins. Cora halted the mare. "We're at the tree line. The fence is about 50 yards ahead." "Do you smell it?" Elias asked, his nostrils flaring. Cora took a deep breath of the freezing air. Beneath the crisp scent of pine and snow, there was something sickeningly sweet. Raw meat. And copper. "Blood," Elias corrected grimly. "Lead me to the fence." When they reached the perimeter, Cora's stomach dropped. She slid down from the saddle, the snow crunching loudly under her boots. "The wire is cut," she reported, her voice flat, keeping the tremor out of it. 3 strands, sheared clean through. "The posts are pulled down, the heifers are gone. The tracks lead north, out toward the open range." Elias dismounted, his cane sinking deep into the snow. He didn't ask about the cattle. He walked forward, his free hand outstretched, sweeping the freezing air until his fingers brushed the splintered wood of the downed fence post. He followed it to the ground. "Where is the dog, Cora?" Cora lifted the kerosene lantern, casting a sickly yellow circle over the trampled snow. Her breath caught in her throat. "Elias, tell me." "He's by the brush, about 10 feet to your right." Elias navigated the uneven ground. Cora watched, a heavy ache blooming in her chest, as the massive, scarred man fell to his knees in the snow. His large hands, rough as sandpaper, reached out and found the stiffening body of the blue heeler. Beside the dog lay a chunk of raw beef, stained with a strange, dark powder. Poison. Elias didn't speak. He ran his hands over the dog's coarse fur, his massive shoulders bowing under a weight that had nothing to do with the cold. The dog had been his eyes in the pasture, a loyal companion in a world that had abandoned him. Cora stood entirely still, watching the blind cowboy grieve in the suffocating silence of the frontier. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't touch his shoulder. She simply stood guard, holding the lantern high against the encroaching dark. "Leave him," Elias finally said. His voice scraped hollow. He stood up, his joints popping in the cold. "The ground is too hard to dig. We'll wrap him in a tarp and bury him in the spring thaw." "Who did this, Elias?" "Silas Blackwood." Elias turned his face into the biting wind, his sightless eyes narrowed. "He's been sending his riders to spook the herd for a month. But this is an escalation." "Why?" Cora asked, stepping closer, the lantern light catching the jagged scar on his jaw. "Your land is hardscrabble. You don't have the acreage to compete with a cattle baron." "I don't have the acreage, but I have the water," Elias replied coldly. "The Shattered Pine sits directly over the natural hot springs that feed the deep creek. My water doesn't freeze in January. Blackwood's northern streams do. If it's a hard winter, he stands to lose 3,000 head of cattle to dehydration and ice. Unless he owns my creek." Cora looked at the cut wire, then at the dead dog, realizing the terrifying magnitude of the trap they were in. This wasn't just a rivalry, it was a siege. They rode back to the cabin in the gray, muted light of dawn. But the peace of the morning was already broken. Waiting for them in the yard, sitting atop a magnificent coal-black stallion, was Silas Blackwood. He was flanked by 3 rough-looking ranch hands, their hands resting casually near the holsters at their hips. Silas himself looked entirely out of place against the rotting timber of the Shattered Pine. He wore a coat of thick imported wool, a silk cravat, and a pristine Stetson. He was smoking a cigar, the sweet, cloying smell of tobacco rolling across the cold air. Elias pulled his gelding to a halt. His posture went rigid, transforming him from a grieving rancher into a towering, terrifying monument of violence. "You're trespassing, Silas," Elias said, his voice a lethal, quiet rumble. "Just a neighborly visit, Elias," Silas drawled, taking a slow drag from his cigar. He smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips. "I see you were out early. Lose some stock in the night? It's a shame. A blind man has a hard enough time keeping track of his own boots, let alone a herd of wandering heifers." Cora's hand instinctively drifted toward the hunting knife strapped to her belt under her coat. She maneuvered her mare until she was shoulder to shoulder with Elias. Silas's dark eyes shifted to her. His smile widened, turning thoroughly unpleasant. "And this must be the famous Widow Vance. I heard you took in a stray, Elias. But a woman with 2 dead husbands in her wake, that's bad luck to bring onto a failing spread. Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers." "Keep her name out of your mouth," Elias snapped, the leather reins groaning in his white-knuckled grip. "Say your piece and get off my land." "I'm here to make you a final offer, Thorne." Silas pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from his breast pocket. $500, for the deed and the water rights. You sign it, take the widow, and move to Cheyenne where you belong. You can buy a nice, warm house by a train station and live out your dark days in comfort. My land isn't for sale. "It's going to be a brutal winter, Elias," Silas said softly, the faux politeness dropping from his voice, revealing the venom underneath. "Fences rot, cattle wander. Dogs eat things they shouldn't. Accidents happen out here every day. It would be a tragedy if a fire started in your cabin while you were sleeping. A blind man wouldn't even see the smoke until his lungs were burning." The threat hung in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. Elias didn't flinch. He leaned forward in his saddle. "You send your men onto my land in the dark again, Silas, and I won't bother calling the sheriff. I'll shoot blindly into the night, and I promise you, I will hit something." Silas stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He tucked the paper back into his coat. "Pride is a warm blanket, Elias, but it won't keep you from freezing to death. Have it your way." Silas tipped his hat mockingly to Cora. "Good luck, widow, you'll need it." He spurred his stallion, wheeling around and riding back toward the main trail, his men trailing behind him like a pack of loyal wolves. Cora watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Elias. The wind whipped his dark hair around his scarred face. He looked like a man made of stone, unyielding and doomed. "He's going to kill you, Elias," Cora said quietly. Elias turned his sightless eyes toward her voice. The anger in his face slowly melted away, leaving only a profound, exhausted isolation. "I know," he said. "Pack your things, Cora. I'll pay for your train ticket to Cheyenne. Our deal is done." "No," Cora said, her voice cracking like a whip across the yard. Elias recoiled slightly, stunned by the sheer ferocity in her tone. "I didn't ask for your charity in town, and I'm not asking for your protection now," Cora snarled, dismounting and tying her horse to the rail. She marched up to Elias's stirrup, grabbing the leather to steady herself. "He cut our fence. He killed our dog. You think I'm going to run from a man in a silk cravat because he made a threat?" "Cora, you don't understand." "I understand survival perfectly, Mr. Thorne," she interrupted, her eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. "I am going to town. I am buying 3 spools of barbed wire, 50 pounds of flour, and 2 boxes of Winchester ammunition. You are going to stay here and dig a grave for Blue. And tonight, we are going to rebuild that fence." Elias sat on his horse, struck completely silent. He couldn't see the fire in her eyes, but he could feel the absolute, unshakable heat of her presence. For the first time since the lightning took his sight, Elias Thorne realized he was not fighting alone. The wagon wheels rattled over the frozen, rutted road leading into Oak Haven, the sound a steady, agonizing drumbeat in Cora's ears. She sat rigid on the wooden bench, her hands gripping the leather reins tight enough to make her knuckles ache. Beneath the seat, wrapped in an old burlap sack, lay Elias's heavy Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. It was fully loaded. Elias had hated letting her go alone. He had stood in the yard, his hands clenching and unclenching around his cane, arguing that Blackwood's men would be in town. But pragmatism had won out. They couldn't afford to lose another day's daylight. Elias had to stay and mend the shattered fence posts by touch, while Cora secured the supplies that would keep them alive through the blizzards. The town of Oak Haven was bustling despite the biting cold. As Cora drove the wagon down the main street toward the Mercantile, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped. Women on the boardwalk pulled their shawls tighter and turned their faces away. The men, lingering outside the saloon, watched her with narrowed, calculating eyes. She was no longer just the cursed widow. She was the woman who had hitched her wagon to a dead man walking. Word of Blackwood's ultimatum had already spread. Cora tied the draft horse to the hitching post outside the Mercantile. She ignored the stares, her spine straight, her face a mask of complete indifference. She walked inside, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the heavy silence that immediately fell over the store. 3 spools of barbed wire, 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt, and 2 boxes of .44-40 cartridges, Cora said, slapping her hard-earned coins onto the wooden counter. The proprietor, a balding man named Higgins, stared at the coins, then at her. He nervously wiped his hands on his apron. "Mrs. Vance, I don't know if I can fulfill that order today." "I see the wire sitting right there in the corner, Mr. Higgins," Cora said, her voice dangerously calm. "And I can smell the flour. Is my money no good here?" Higgins swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the front window. "It ain't your money, ma'am. Well, mister. Blackwood mentioned he might be needing all the spare wire I have in stock for his northern pastures." Cora's blood ran cold. The siege wasn't just on the ranch. It was here, in the heart of the town. Blackwood was cutting off their supply lines. "Mr. Blackwood is not here," Cora said, stepping closer to the counter, dropping her voice to a lethal register. "I am. And if you don't load those supplies into my wagon right now, I will walk across the street to the telegraph office and wire the federal marshal in Cheyenne to ask why a local proprietor is refusing legal tender under duress from a cattle baron." Higgins paled. He didn't want the law snooping around Oak Haven any more than Silas did. Mumbling under his breath, he grabbed a ledger. "Pull your wagon around to the back alley. I'll have my boy loaded out the rear doors." "Thank you," Cora said coldly. She walked out, untied the horse, and guided the wagon into the narrow, shadow-drenched alley behind the Mercantile. Piles of discarded crates and frozen mud made the path treacherous. She pulled the brake lever and waited. 5 minutes passed. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the store remained shut. A prickle of pure, primal warning crawled up the back of Cora's neck. The hair on her arms stood on end. It was the same physical reaction she used to get right before her first husband would walk through the front door, drunk and looking for a reason to break something. She heard the crunch of boots on frozen mud behind her. Not 1 pair. 3. Cora didn't turn around immediately. She slowly, deliberately reached her right hand under the wagon seat, her fingers brushing the coarse burlap sack. "Well, look what we have here," a voice drawled. It was rough, laced with chewing tobacco and malice. Cora turned slowly. Standing at the mouth of the alley, blocking her exit, were 3 of Blackwood's riders. The leader was a thick-necked brute named Miller, the man who had been flanking Silas at the ranch that morning. "Mr. Higgins is taking a while with your order, widow," Miller grinned, spitting a stream of brown juice into the snow. "Fact is, he ain't bringing it out at all. Mr. Blackwood bought out the Mercantile's entire stock of wire and powder 5 minutes ago." Cora's grip tightened on the cold steel of the Winchester barrel hidden beneath the sack. "Get out of my way, Miller." The men chuckled. They began to spread out, moving slowly down the alley, boxing her in. "You're a long way from your blind cripple, ain't you?" Miller taunted, stepping closer. The smell of stale whiskey rolled off him. "You know it's a shame a pretty little thing like you is wasting away out there in the cold. Thorne can't even see what he's got. Why don't you climb down off that wagon and come and have a drink with some real men?" I said, "Get out of my way." Cora's voice didn't shake. It went completely, terrifyingly flat. Miller's eyes darkened. The amusement vanished, replaced by cruel intent. He stepped up to the wagon, reaching out to grab her ankle and drag her down into the mud. "You arrogant bitch! I'll teach you how to speak to—" He never finished the sentence. Cora moved with a speed and fluidity born of pure, distilled trauma. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for women who had men to protect them. Cora Vance had only ever had herself. In one seamless motion, she ripped the burlap sack away, yanked the Winchester from beneath the seat, leveled the heavy barrel, and cocked the lever. The mechanical clack-clack of the action loading a round echoed off the brick walls of the alley like a death knell. Miller froze, his hand inches from her boot. The bore of the 4440 was pointed directly at the bridge of his nose. "I am not going to ask you a third time," Cora said. Her eyes were dead, vacant pools of black. Miller swallowed, holding his hands up slowly. But his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his men. "You ain't gonna shoot that widow. You don't have the nerve. The recoil will break your damn collarbone." He shifted his weight, preparing to lunge. Cora didn't blink. She lowered the barrel a fraction of an inch and pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of the rifle shattered the quiet of the afternoon. A massive plume of white smoke erupted from the barrel. Miller screamed, a high, panicked sound, as his right leg kicked out from under him. He hit the freezing mud hard, clutching his foot. The other two men swore wildly, reaching for their holsters. Cora had already levered another round into the chamber, the brass casing hitting the wagon floorboards with a ping. She swung the barrel toward the remaining two men, her aim steady, her finger resting perfectly on the trigger. "The next one goes through a kneecap," Cora stated. The ringing in her ears was absolute, but her voice sliced through the smoke. "And the third goes into a chest. Who wants to draw?" The men looked at Miller, who was writhing in the mud. He wasn't bleeding. Cora hadn't shot his foot. She had blown the solid wooden heel completely off his leather boot with terrifying pinpoint accuracy. It was a warning shot that required more skill than a kill shot. The two men slowly raised their hands, stepping backward toward the mouth of the alley. "Get him up," Cora ordered. "And get out." They scrambled forward, hauling Miller to his feet. He was pale, trembling, staring at Cora as if he had just seen the devil incarnate. They dragged him down the alley, slipping in the mud, and disappeared around the corner. The alley fell silent, save for the nervous snorting of the draft horse. Slowly, agonizingly, the adrenaline began to drain from Cora's system. The icy cold rushed back in. She lowered the rifle, resting the barrel on her knees. Only then, when she was completely alone, did her hands begin to shake. A violent, uncontrollable tremor racked her shoulders. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wooden seat, struggling to pull air into her burning lungs. 5 miles away, at the shattered pine, Elias stood in the north pasture, his bare hands bleeding from wrapping barbed wire around the frozen cedar posts. He had stopped working. His head was turned sharply to the south toward town. Through the miles of empty frozen air, his heightened hearing had caught it. A sharp, distinct crack. It wasn't the dull boom of a shotgun or the sharp pop of a revolver. It was the heavy, unmistakable report of a Winchester .44-40, his rifle. Elias's heart stopped. The spool of wire dropped from his bleeding hands, hitting the snow with a dull thud. He stood there in the vast, crushing darkness of his blindness, the wind whipping his coat, listening with an intensity that bordered on madness. He waited for a second shot, He waited for the sound of a galloping horse. He waited to hear if his entire world had just ended in a muddy alleyway in Oakhaven. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Silence reigned over the prairie. Elias didn't move. He stood facing the road, the cold biting into his flesh, an agonizing prayer locked tight in his throat. He realized then with a terrifying clarity that if Cora Vance did not come back up that road, he would not just lose his ranch. He would lose the only light he had left. 2 hours later, the faint, rhythmic squeak of wagon wheels reached his ears. Elias took a shuddering breath, his chest collapsing in overwhelming relief. He stepped out onto the trail, waiting. When the wagon finally pulled into the yard, Cora brought the horse to a halt. She looked down at Elias. His hands were torn and bloody from the wire. His scarred face was pale with cold and tension. He walked up to the side of the wagon. He reached up, his blind hands finding the wooden edge of the seat, then traveling upward until his rough fingers brushed the heavy wool of her coat. He felt the rapid, exhausted rise and fall of her chest. "I heard the shot," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. Cora looked down at his battered, searching hands. She didn't put on a brave face. "They tried to box me in the alley. Silas's men." Elias's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. His fingers moved, brushing against the cold steel barrel of the Winchester resting on her lap. He felt the lingering warmth of the chamber. "Did you hit anyone?" "I shot the heel off Miller's boot," Cora said quietly. "They ran." Elias went perfectly still. He traced the barrel of the rifle, understanding the incredible nerve and skill it took to make a shot like that under pressure. He had assumed she was a victim of her past, a woman who needed a roof to hide under. He was wrong. "Where did you learn to shoot like that, Cora?" Cora stared out over the frozen prairie, the ghosts of her past rising in the bitter wind. "When a woman is trapped in a house with a man who uses his fists, Elias, she learns that tears don't stop the bleeding. Only cold steel does. I promised myself I would never be a victim again." Elias slowly removed his hand from the rifle. He reached up, his thumb gently brushing the dirt and snow from the edge of her jawline. The touch was startlingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence they had both endured that day. "You aren't a victim, Cora," Elias murmured, his blind eyes locked on her face with piercing intensity. "You are the most dangerous thing in this valley." Cora looked at him, feeling the ironclad walls around her heart begin to splinter. "Help me unload the wagon," she said, her voice softening for the first time since she had arrived. "We have a fence to fix." Elias nodded. Together, the blind cowboy and the Winchester widow turned toward the failing light, ready to face the war that was coming to their doorstep. The wind had died down by midnight, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy enough to crush bone. They had been working the north fence line for 6 hours in the dark. Elias had insisted. Silas Blackwood's men had not returned since the incident in the alley, but the cut wire was a bleeding artery in the ranch's defenses that had to be tourniqueted before the herd scattered into the freezing void. Cora held the kerosene lantern high, her fingers numb inside her thick leather gloves. The yellow light cast long, jagged shadows across the snow. Elias was working entirely by touch, using a pair of heavy iron stretchers to pull the barbed wire taut against a cedar post. "Hold the lantern lower," Elias grunted, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "I need to feel the tension on the lower strand." Cora dropped to one knee, bringing the light down. She watched his massive hands, ungloved so he could read the wire. They were a map of old violence, crisscrossed with white scars. "It's too tight, Elias," Cora warned, seeing the rusted metal of the old wire straining against the new spool. "The frost made it brittle. If you pull the lever again—" "I need it flush," he interrupted, his jaw set in stubborn granite. He leaned his weight onto the stretcher handle. The sound was like a rifle shot. Snap! The brittle wire sheared under the immense pressure. It whipped through the air with terrifying velocity. a steel lash lined with razor-sharp barbs. Elias didn't even have time to flinch. The wire tore across his left forearm, slicing cleanly through the thick canvas of his coat, the flannel shirt beneath, and deep into the flesh. A sharp, guttural hiss escaped his teeth. He dropped the stretchers, his right hand instantly clamping over his left forearm. Even in the dim lantern light, Cora saw the dark, heavy arterial bloom of blood soaking rapidly through the torn canvas. "Elias!" Cora dropped the lantern, careful to keep it upright in the snow, and scrambled to his side. "I'm fine," he grated out, though his voice was entirely stripped of air. He took a stumbling step backward, his boots slipping on the ice. "Bind it. Just bind it so we can finish." "You stubborn fool, you've cut to the muscle," Cora snapped, her survivor's instincts overriding his pride. She didn't ask permission. She grabbed his heavy arm, her grip ironclad, and shoved him toward the bay mare. "Get on the horse. We are going back to the cabin. Now." For once, Elias didn't fight her. The blood loss and the freezing temperatures was already making him dizzy. He gripped the saddle horn, his knuckles stark white, and let her lead him through the dark. By the time they reached the shattered pine, Elias's left sleeve was saturated, the blood freezing into a dark, stiff crust. Cora kicked the cabin door open, practically dragging him inside. "Sit by the stove," she ordered. She didn't panic. Panic was for women who hadn't patched up a drunken husband after a barroom brawl. She moved with ruthless efficiency, throwing 3 logs into the dying embers, and pumping freezing water from the indoor basin into a tin bowl. She fetched her sewing kit from her saddlebag, a needle thick enough for leather, and heavy black cotton thread. "Take the coat off," she commanded, kneeling beside his chair. Elias unbuttoned the canvas coat with his good hand, his breath hissing sharply through his teeth as he peeled the blood-soaked fabric away from the wound. The laceration was deep, a jagged, ugly tear running 4 inches across the meat of his forearm. The smell of copper was thick and heavy in the small, warm cabin. Cora cleaned the wound with whiskey, wiping away the blood with a clean rag. Elias didn't make a sound, though the muscles in his chest jumped, rigid with agony. "This is going to hurt," Cora said quietly. She held the needle over the open flame of the kerosene lamp to sterilize it. "I've felt worse," Elias murmured, his sightless eyes fixed straight ahead, staring into the dark corner of the room. "Hold still." Cora pierced his skin with the needle. It was brutal, intimate work. The cabin was utterly silent except for the crackle of the stove and the soft, wet sound of the thread pulling through flesh. Cora's face was inches from his arm, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, the lantern light catching the golden strands of hair that had escaped her braid. She expected him to turn away, to endure it in the stoic, masculine silence he used like a shield. Instead, Elias moved his right hand. Slowly, his large, calloused fingers drifted through the air until they found the edge of her shoulder. He didn't grip her. His touch was feather-light, shockingly gentle for a man of his size. His fingertips slid up the coarse wool of her coat, finding the column of her neck, and finally coming to rest against the side of her face. Cora froze. The needle stopped halfway through a stitch. Elias's thumb slowly traced the line of her jaw. He felt the tension there, the permanent defensive set of a woman who had spent her life waiting for the next blow. He moved his hand higher, his rough fingertips mapping the high curve of her cheekbone, the faint silver scar near her temple that she always tried to hide with her hair. He was seeing her, truly seeing her in the only way he could. "Your heart is beating like a trapped bird, Cora," Elias whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate straight through her chest. "You're bleeding, Elias. I need to finish. I need to—" Her voice trembled, betraying the absolute calm she was trying to project. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his thumb gently brushing over her lower lip. "When Blackwood threatened you. When Miller cornered you in the alley. You had the money I gave you. You had the rifle. You could have boarded the train to Cheyenne. Cora looked up from the wound. She looked at his face, the brutal scar on his jaw, the clouded, unseeing eyes that held more depth than any sighted man she had ever known. The walls she had built around herself for 10 years were crumbling under the weight of his calloused touch. "Because in Cheyenne I would just be another widow hiding in the corners," Cora said, her voice dropping to a fierce, raw whisper. "Because here I am not a victim. And because—" she swallowed hard, leaning slightly into his palm. "Because nobody danced with you, Elias. And I know what it feels like to stand in a crowded room and realize the world expects you to die quietly." Elias's breath caught. The stoic, unbreakable cowboy fractured right there in the dim light of the cabin. He slid his hand down from her face, his fingers wrapping around her blood-stained hands, completely ignoring the needle. He held her rough, calloused palms against his chest, right over the heavy, frantic beating of his heart. "Thank you," Elias whispered, his voice cracking, laying bare the profound, agonizing loneliness of the last 2 years. "Thank you for not looking at me like a broken thing. There was no kiss. A kiss would have been too simple, too easy. This was a claiming of souls." In the quiet, blood-stained cabin surrounded by the freezing frontier, they sat tethered together by pain and absolute, unflinching acceptance. For the first time since the lightning took his eyes, Elias Thorne was not in the dark. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. It broke on a Tuesday night, riding in on the back of the most violent blizzard Wyoming had seen in a decade. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a deafening continuous roar that rattled the heavy log walls of the shattered pine, and drove the snow horizontally across the prairie. Cora was asleep on the cot, buried under 3 wool blankets, dreaming of a hearth fire that didn't burn. She woke to the smell of sulfur and pitch. She sat up, gasping. The cabin was freezing, but the air was thick, stinging her eyes. She coughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Elias!" Cora shouted, throwing off the blankets. Elias was already coming down the loft ladder, dressed only in his canvas trousers, his chest bare to the freezing air. He didn't have his cane. He didn't need it. His face was a mask of absolute primal terror. "The barn!" Elias roared over the sound of the wind tearing at the roof. "Blackwood's men! They used the storm for cover!" Cora didn't bother with her coat. She shoved her feet into her boots, grabbed the heavy wool blanket off her cot, and threw open the cabin door. The heat hit her first, a physical blow that knocked her back a step. The blizzard was a swirling vortex of white, but the center of the yard was illuminated by a towering, monstrous pillar of orange and yellow. The barn was fully engulfed. The dry winter hay in the loft had gone up like gunpowder. The flames were licking 50 feet into the night sky, devouring the dried timber with a horrifying, roaring hunger. And inside, the draft horse and the bay mare were screaming. It was a high, shrill sound of pure animal panic that tore at Cora's soul. "The horses!" Cora screamed, sprinting into the blinding snow. "Cora! No!" Elias bellowed, lunging after her, his bare feet sinking into the freezing drifts. But Cora was already at the barn doors. The heat was searing, blistering the skin on her face. She threw the heavy wool blanket over her head to shield herself, and shoved her weight against the sliding wooden doors. They gave way with a groan, releasing a massive backdraft of thick, choking black smoke. Cora plunged into the inferno. The inside of the barn was a vision of hell. The roof beams were completely ablaze, dropping showers of burning embers into the center aisle. The smoke was a solid, impenetrable wall. In an instant, Cora was completely blinded. Her eyes streamed with tears, burning as if rubbed with ground glass. She couldn't see the stalls. She couldn't see the door she had just walked through. She dropped to her knees, seeking the meager pocket of clean air near the dirt floor, coughing violently. "Easy, boy, easy!" she tried to shout to the horses, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire. She crawled forward, her hands touching burning debris. She found the iron latch of the first stall entirely by accident. She threw it open. The draft horse bolted past her, a massive, terrified shadow, its hooves missing her head by inches as it fled into the snow. Cora scrambled toward the second stall, reaching for the latch. Above her, a horrific crack echoed over the roar. Cora looked up, squinting through the tearing smoke. The main central support beam, weakened by the fire and the weight of the snow on the roof, snapped. A shower of burning timber collapsed directly between Cora and the open doorway, blocking her exit. A wall of flames shot up, trapping her against the back of the stalls. The oxygen in the small space was instantly sucked away. Cora collapsed onto the dirt, coughing up black soot, her lungs screaming for air. The heat was unbearable, singeing her hair, baking the moisture from her skin. She tried to crawl backward, but her back hit the solid log wall. She was blind. She was trapped. She was going to burn alive. "Elias!" she gasped, a tiny broken sound lost in the inferno. She curled into a ball, pulling the wool blanket tight over her head, waiting for the end. Then the wall of flames in front of her exploded outward. A massive figure tore through the burning debris like a vengeful god. It was Elias. He had no blanket. His bare chest was streaked with black soot, his canvas trousers smoking. To a sighted man, the smoke would have been completely blinding, the disorientation lethal. But Elias Thorne lived in the dark. The thick black smoke meant absolutely nothing to him. He navigated the inferno with terrifying precision. He felt the intense, radiating heat of the collapsed beam on his right, and heard the snap of the burning stall door on his left. He heard the ragged, dying sound of Cora's coughing over the roar of the fire. "Cora!" he roared. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. He waded through the burning embers, his bare feet blistering, and dropped to his knees exactly where she lay. His massive hands found her shoulders, gripping her with crushing force. He hauled her up against his chest, burying her face into the crook of his neck to shield her lungs. "I've got you. I've got you," he chanted, a desperate mantra. Elias stood up, carrying her dead weight as easily as a child. He turned blindly back toward the door. A flaming piece of the loft collapsed, striking his shoulder, singeing his skin. Elias only grunted, tightening his grip on Cora, and charged straight through the wall of fire, bursting out into the freezing, swirling blizzard. They collapsed together in the snow 20 yards from the burning barn. Cora rolled out of his arms, hacking violently, sucking the freezing, clean air into her burning lungs. She lay in the snow, her chest heaving, the icy flakes melting instantly against her blistered face. Beside her, Elias was on his hands and knees. He was breathing hard, his broad back rising and falling. The firelight danced across the brutal new burns on his shoulder and chest. Cora crawled toward him, her hands shaking, reaching out to touch his burned skin. "Elias, you came in. You couldn't see. Don't touch me." The words were spoken with a quiet, devastating finality that stopped Cora's hand in midair. Elias pushed himself back, creating a physical distance between them in the snow. He wasn't looking toward the burning barn. His unseeing eyes were fixed on the ground, his face a mask of absolute horrifying realization. He could smell the singed ends of her hair. He could hear the terrifying wet rasp in her lungs. He could feel the blistering heat radiating off her clothes. "Elias?" Cora whispered, her voice raw. "Blackwood used the storm because he knew I couldn't hear his men approaching over the wind," Elias said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, hollowed out by a despair so deep it had no bottom. "He knew I was blind. He knew I couldn't defend the perimeter. We survived. The horses got out. We can rebuild." "You almost died, Cora." Elias finally lifted his head, turning his scarred, soot-stained face toward her. The agony in his voice shattered the howling wind. "You were trapped in a burning building, and I didn't see the smoke until the roof was caving in. My darkness almost killed you." "No, you saved me. You walked through the fire." "I am the reason the fire was set," Elias roared, slamming his burned fist into the snow. Silence fell between them, heavier than the blizzard. The barn behind them began to collapse in on itself, sending up a massive plume of sparks. But Elias didn't flinch. He reached into the pocket of his trousers. His hands, shaking violently, pulled out a small, heavy cloth bundle. He leaned forward and pressed it into Cora's soot-stained hands. It was heavy. It clinked. Silver dollars. Every last cent he had saved from the fall cattle sale. "Elias, what is this?" Cora asked, her heart dropping into her stomach, a cold far worse than the snow creeping into her veins. "It's over," Elias said, his voice dropping to a harsh mechanical whisper. He was retreating, throwing up walls of iron and stone, locking himself away where she could never reach him. "The pact is broken. There is no ranch left to work. I will not let you burn to death because I am too proud to surrender." "I'm not leaving you," Cora cried, scrambling toward him, gripping the lapels of his coat. "You don't get to decide this for me. I chose to stay." Elias reached up and grabbed her wrists. His grip was not gentle this time. It was unyielding, breaking her hold on him. He pushed her hands away. "My darkness is going to get you killed, Cora," Elias stated, the absolute certainty in his voice sounding like a judge reading a death sentence. "Take the mare. She's saddled. Ride to Oakhaven. Get on the first train to Cheyenne and never look back at this cursed place." He stood up, turning his back on her, turning his back on the burning ruins of his life. "Go," he ordered the empty, swirling snow. He didn't look back as he walked blindly toward the dark, freezing cabin, leaving Cora Vance kneeling alone in the snow, clutching a bag of silver she didn't want, as the world burned down around them. The morning after the blizzard broke, the world was a frozen, monochrome graveyard. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made the ears ring. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, offering no warmth, only a flat, indifferent light that stretched across the snow-choked prairie. Elias Thorne sat on the edge of the cabin porch. He wore no coat over his soot-stained flannel shirt. The brutal, blistering cold bit into his bare hands, but he didn't feel it. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his sightless eyes staring out into the devastating quiet. The air was heavy with the acrid, sickening stench of wet ash and charred pine. The barn was gone. He didn't need eyes to know it was nothing but a smoldering black scar on the earth. Inside the cabin, the heavy wooden table was empty. When Elias had woken an hour before dawn, the silence in the room had been complete. No rustle of heavy wool skirts, no soft, methodical clinking of the coffee pot being set on the iron stove. The canvas cot in the corner was cold and empty. The heavy bag of silver dollars he had pressed into Cora's soot-stained hands the night before was gone. She had done exactly what he had ordered her to do. She had taken the surviving mare, ridden out into the dying storm, and saved herself. Elias swallowed, his throat feeling like it was lined with shattered glass. It was the right thing. It was the only thing. He had forced her away to protect her from Blackwood's crosshairs and from the suffocating anchor of his own blindness. Yet, as he sat alone in the freezing ashes of his life, the emptiness in his chest was a physical agony, a hollow, gaping wound that bled far worse than the barbed wire cut on his arm. He gripped his hickory cane, waiting. Silas Blackwood would come this morning. The cattle baron would ride out to survey the ashes, bringing the deed to the shattered pine. And this time, Elias knew he would not have the strength or the will to fight. He was finally, truly broken. Then a sound cut through the freezing dead air. Thwack! Elias's head jerked up. His grip on the cane tightened, his knuckles popping. Thwack! Thwack! It wasn't the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't the heavy, arrogant crunch of Blackwood's boots in the snow. It was a sharp, rhythmic, metallic ringing. Iron striking iron, wood splintering under force. Elias pushed himself off the porch. He didn't bother navigating the snow-drifted path. He walked a straight line toward the ruins of the barn, his boots sinking to the knee, his heart suddenly hammering a frantic, impossible rhythm against his ribs. The smell of ash grew suffocating. The heat of the smoldering embers radiated against his face. Thwack! "Who's there?" Elias's voice was a raw, gravelly bark that tore at his ruined throat. The hammering stopped. A heavy breath, ragged and exhausted, plumed in the freezing air just 10 feet in front of him. "The center beam is gone, Elias," a voice said. Elias froze. The cane slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the snow without a sound. It was impossible. It had to be a ghost born of his own desperate, unraveling mind. "But the 4 corner posts are deep set," the voice continued, completely ignoring his shock. It was flat, breathless, and laced with an iron-clad stubbornness. "The fire didn't reach the roots. If we clear the charred cross timbers today, we can string a canvas tarp over the southwest corner to shelter the draft horse tonight." "Cora!" He breathed the name like a prayer. He lunged forward, his boots slipping in the ash and snow, until his outstretched hands collided with a solid, trembling shoulder wrapped in heavy wool. He grabbed her, his massive hands sliding down her arms, confirming she was real, solid, and standing in the freezing ruins. "What are you doing here?" Elias demanded, his voice cracking violently. "I told you to leave. I gave you the silver. You were supposed to be on the train." Cora didn't pull away. She stood her ground, her face smeared with black soot, her knuckles split and bleeding around the wooden handle of a heavy iron hammer. "I took the silver," Cora stated, her voice trembling not from cold but from sheer, unadulterated fury. "I rode the mare all the way to Oakhaven at first light. I woke up Mr. Higgins by throwing a rock through his bedroom window." Elias's hands gripped her upper arms tightly. "And you bought a ticket." "I bought 4 kegs of square-cut nails, 2 axes, a cross-cut saw, and a heavy canvas tarp," Cora snarled, stepping into his space, forcing him to feel the heat of her anger. "I loaded them onto a rented wagon and drove them back here. The silver is gone, Elias. Every last cent." Elias was struck entirely dumb. His scarred face went pale under the soot. "Why? Silas will kill us both. I have nothing left to protect you with. I'm in the dark, Cora. I couldn't even see the flames until they were burning you." "I don't need your protection," Cora shouted, her voice echoing over the desolate, frozen prairie. The tears she had refused to shed for 10 years finally broke, spilling hot and fast down her ash-stained cheeks. "I didn't stay because I need a hero, Elias. I stayed because when I look at you, I don't see a broken, blind cripple. I see the only man who has ever treated me like an equal. I see the man who caught me when I fell off the roof. I see the man who walked into a burning building to find me." She dropped the hammer. It hit the frozen ground with a dull thud. She reached up, her blistered, bleeding hands gripping the lapels of his coat, shaking him with a surprising, desperate strength. "I spent my whole life running," Cora wept, her forehead dropping against his chest. "Running from men who hurt me. Running from towns that whispered about me. Running from the cold. But I am done running. The shattered pine is my home. You are my home. And I will not let you chase me away just because you're scared to hope again." Elias stopped breathing. The walls of iron and stone he had built around his heart, the fortress of isolation he had maintained for 2 years, shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He released her arms, sliding his massive, trembling hands up to her face. He cupped her cheeks, his thumbs wiping away the hot tears and the soot. He felt the rapid, terrified pulse at her jawline. Before he could pull her into his arms, the ground beneath their boots began to vibrate. Elias's head snapped up, his instincts instantly flaring. The tender moment evaporated into freezing adrenaline. "Horses," he hissed. "A lot of them, coming fast from the south ridge." Cora wiped her eyes, spinning around to face the trail. Through the gray morning mist, a line of dark riders emerged. It was Silas Blackwood. And this time he hadn't just brought 3 men. A dozen hired guns rode behind him, their horses' breath pluming like dragon smoke in the freezing air. They spread out as they entered the yard, forming a deadly, inescapable half-circle around the charred ruins of the barn. Silas halted his black stallion. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, looking down at the ashes, and then at Elias and Cora standing in the wreckage. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Silas drawled, the sound carrying easily in the dead quiet. "Looks like a stray ember from your stove caught the hay, Elias. A terrible tragedy. It's exactly what I warned you about. The frontier is a dangerous place for a man who can't see the sparks." Elias stepped slightly in front of Cora, shielding her body with his own. "You burned my barn, Silas. You nearly killed the woman Elias's jaw locked, his sightless eyes narrowed into slits of pure, murderous rage. "You nearly killed her." "Prove it," Silas mocked smoothly. He pulled the familiar folded parchment from his coat. "The sheriff is a practical man. He'll see a blind rancher who made a fatal mistake. Now, you have no barn. You have no winter feed. You have no money. Sign the deed, Elias. I'll give you $100 out of the goodness of my heart, and you two can walk away before the cold finishes the job." "He's not signing anything," Cora said. She stepped out from behind Elias. She didn't have her heavy coat. She was freezing, battered, and covered in soot. But as she walked forward, her spine was straight as a steel rod. In her right hand she held the Winchester 1873. Silas laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Widow, you might have gotten the drop on Miller in an alley, but there are 13 of us here. You can't shoot us all before my men fill you and your blind cowboy full of lead. Put the rifle down." Cora levered around into the chamber. The clack-clack was deafening. She raised the heavy barrel, pointing it directly at the center of Silas Blackwood's chest. "I don't have to shoot them all, Silas," Cora said, her voice dropping to a dead, icy calm that made the hairs on the back of Elias's neck stand up. "I only have to shoot you. And I promise you, before your body hits the snow, my finger will pull this trigger. You want this land? You're going to bleed out on it." The laughter died in Silas's throat. He looked down the barrel of the Winchester, seeing the absolute hollow emptiness in Cora's eyes. She meant it. She was a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose, and those were the most dangerous creatures on God's earth. The hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles. They were paid to intimidate farmers, not to die for a piece of frozen real estate. "You're insane," Silas hissed, his hand hovering over his own holster, calculating the draw. "Maybe," Cora said. "Draw your weapon, Silas. Let's see who's faster." Before Silas could make a move, another sound drifted over the frozen prairie. It was the heavy, rhythmic groaning of wagon wheels, accompanied by the chaotic crunch of dozens of boots and hooves. Silas frowned, looking over his shoulder toward the trail leading back to Oakhaven. Breaking through the morning mist was not a gang of outlaws, but a sprawling makeshift militia. Leading the pack was Mr. Higgins, the mercantile owner, driving a wagon loaded with the lumber Cora had purchased. Beside him rode the town blacksmith, carrying a double-barreled shotgun resting casually across his saddle horn. Behind them walked 20 men from Oakhaven, farmers, clerks, and laborers, armed with hunting rifles, pitchforks, and revolvers. They poured into the yard, flanking Blackwood's men, closing the trap. Silas's face contorted in shock. "Higgins, what the hell is this? I bought and paid for this town." Mr. Higgins halted the wagon. He looked nervous, but he stood up on the buckboard, gripping the reins tightly. "You bought my wire, Mr. Blackwood. You didn't buy me. And when Mrs. Vance came into my store this morning, throwing her last silver dollars on the counter to buy nails to rebuild a burned-down barn, well, it shamed me. It shamed the whole damn town. We ain't going to stand by and watch you freeze a blind man and a widow off their rightful claim." The blacksmith cocked his shotgun, the loud click echoing in the yard. "The fire was an accident, Silas, a terrible tragedy. But if you or your men draw a weapon on Mrs. Vance, I reckon there's going to be another tragedy right here in this yard." Silas looked around. His 13 hired guns were now staring down 25 armed, angry townsfolk holding the high ground. The odds had violently shifted. The isolation that Silas had relied upon to break Elias was gone. The town had finally found its spine, and Cora Vance had forged it for them. Silas Blackwood's face turned a mottled, furious purple. He stared at Cora, who still had the Winchester leveled at his heart, unblinking. "This isn't over," Silas spat venomously. "Yes, it is," Elias said, his deep voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Get off my land, Silas, and don't ever ride this far north again." Silas yanked his reins fiercely, turning the black stallion. "Ride out!" he barked to his men. The cattle baron and his hired guns spurred their horses, galloping back toward the south ridge, kicking up clouds of white snow as they fled the shattered pine. The silence that followed was entirely different from the dead quiet of the morning. It was the silence of survival. It was the sound of the storm finally breaking. Cora slowly lowered the Winchester. The adrenaline crashed out of her system, leaving her legs weak and trembling. She dropped the rifle into the snow and covered her soot-stained face with her bleeding hands, a ragged sob tearing from her throat. Elias didn't wait. He crossed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He didn't use his cane. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, his powerful arms wrapping around her waist, and hoisted her entirely off the frozen ground. He crushed her against his chest. Cora buried her face in his neck, her arms wrapping fiercely around his broad shoulders, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing left in the universe. The townsfolk began to dismount, respectfully turning their backs or busying themselves with unloading the wagon to give them a moment of privacy. Elias buried his face in her soot-stained hair, breathing in the smell of smoke, cold, and the woman who had just saved his life. "You crazy, stubborn woman," he murmured fiercely against her ear. "I told you," Cora wept, her tears soaking his collar. "I'm not leaving." Elias pulled back just enough to find her face. His large hands cupped her cheeks, his thumbs tracing her jawline. His clouded eyes were dark with an emotion so profound it bordered on reverence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers blindly, instinctively, and with absolute certainty. It was their first kiss, and there was nothing gentle or hesitant about it. It was a collision of survival. It tasted of ash, salt water, and iron. It was a desperate, sweeping, possessive sealing of a bond forged in fire and freezing wind. Cora kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the earth. When Elias finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, they were both breathing heavily, their breath mingling in the cold air. "I can't see the sunrise, Cora," Elias whispered, his voice thick with a raw, undeniable love. "But I swear to God I can feel the light." Cora smiled, the expression cracking the soot on her face. "Come on, cowboy," she whispered softly, taking his scarred hand in hers. "We have a barn to build." Spring did not arrive quietly in Wyoming. It came in a rush of roaring creeks, cracking ice, and the heavy, sweet scent of thawing mud and blooming sagebrush. It had been 4 months since the blizzard. The world had turned from a monochrome graveyard into a vibrant, brilliant canvas of green. Cora stood on the porch of the shattered pine. The heavy winter wool was gone, replaced by a simple, crisp dress of sky-blue cotton she had sewn herself. Her blonde hair, normally braided tight for work, was pinned up softly, catching the warm May sunlight. The brutal blisters and burns on her hands had faded into tough, capable calluses. She leaned against the freshly painted white railing of the porch, looking out over the yard. The shattered pine was no longer broken. Where the charred ruins of the old barn had once stood, a new structure had risen. It wasn't as massive as Blackwood's grand stables, but it was solid, built of thick raw pine that still bled fragrant golden sap in the sun. The fences, stretching out toward the north ridge, were straight and true, the barbed wire gleaming like silver thread. The Deepwater Creek was running high and fast, completely free of ice. They had not done it alone. Following the standoff in the snow, the town of Oakhaven had fundamentally changed. Mr. Higgins had extended them unlimited credit through the winter. The blacksmith had forged new hinges and nails for the barn at no cost. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the cursed widow and the blind cripple had ridden out every weekend, bringing hot stews, strong backs, and hammers. They had built the barn together. They had survived the winter together. Today, the yard was full of those same people. Wagons were parked in neat rows near the corral. Children in their Sunday best chased the surviving blue heeler pup, a gift from the blacksmith, around the water trough. Long wooden tables had been set up under the shade of the large cottonwood trees, groaning under the weight of roasted venison, fresh-baked bread, and Mrs. Higgins's famous apple pies. The sound of a fiddle drifted over the warm air, playing a bright, lively reel. It was a stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the freezing, isolated hell they had endured. The heavy cabin door opened behind Cora. Elias stepped out onto the porch. Cora's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him every day for 6 months, covered in dirt, sawdust, and sweat. But seeing him now made her heart stutter all over again. He wore a dark, tailored suit he had kept preserved in a cedar trunk since before his accident. The crisp white shirt stood in sharp contrast to his sun-browned skin. He was freshly shaved, the jagged scar on his jaw fully visible, no longer a mark of tragedy, but a testament to his survival. He held his hickory cane in his right hand, but his posture was completely transformed. He did not stand like a man bracing for a blow. He stood tall, his broad shoulders relaxed, his head turning slightly as he absorbed the sounds of the celebration in his yard. "You look beautiful, Elias," Cora said softly. Elias turned his head toward her voice. A slow, breathtaking smile broke across his face, reaching the corners of his clouded eyes. It was a smile completely free of shadows. "A blind man in a suit is just a target for spilled cider," Elias chuckled, his deep voice vibrating warmly. He stepped toward her, his cane tapping the floorboards lightly. He navigated the porch with absolute confidence. He knew every inch of this rebuilt space. He stopped perfectly in front of her, reaching out his free hand. Cora placed her hand in his. His thumb stroked her knuckles. "I can smell the lilacs," Elias murmured. "You wore the water you bought from the apothecary." "I wanted to smell like spring," she smiled. "You smell like home," he corrected gently. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "The preacher is ready. Are you?" "I've been ready since the day I threw that hammer in the snow," Cora replied. They didn't walk down an aisle. They didn't need the grand pageantry of a church. They walked side by side to the edge of the porch, standing together at the top of the wooden steps. The fiddle music faded. The chatter of the townsfolk died down as they gathered around the porch, their faces turned upward, filled with genuine respect and warmth. Reverend Stokes, a kindly man with a booming voice, stepped up to the bottom of the stairs, holding his worn leather Bible. The ceremony was incredibly brief. There was no mention of the dead husbands in Cora's past, nor the darkness in Elias's eyes. It was a frontier wedding, stripped of pretense, focused entirely on the raw, undeniable truth of survival and partnership. "Elias Thorne," Reverend Stokes called out, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To shield her in the winter? To labor with her in the spring, and to honor her all the days of your life?" Elias didn't face the preacher. He turned his body toward Cora. He reached out, taking both of her calloused hands in his. "I do," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the wind. "I will be your shield, Cora. You were the light when I had none. I choose you today and every day." Cora's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. "Cora Vance," the preacher continued, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To be his eyes when he cannot see, his strength when the labor is heavy, and his partner in all things?" "I do," Cora said, her voice clear and unbroken. She squeezed Elias's hands tightly. "I will be your eyes, Elias, and you will be my heart. We stand together, or not at all." Then, by the power vested in me and under the wide sky of this frontier, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Stokes smiled broadly. "Elias, you may kiss your bride." Elias dropped his cane. It clattered loudly on the porch boards, but neither of them cared. He pulled Cora flush against his chest, his large hands cradling her face, and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate blood and ash collision of the blizzard. It was a kiss of profound peace, of deep, enduring passion, and of a promise fulfilled. The crowd erupted into cheers. Men threw their hats into the air. The fiddle struck up a joyous, raucous tune that echoed off the mountains. When they parted, Elias rested his forehead against hers, laughing, a rich, deep sound that Cora realized she had never truly heard before. The rest of the afternoon passed in a golden, sun-drenched blur. They did not hide from the crowd. Elias moved through the yard with Cora at his side. She didn't lead him. She merely rested her hand in the crook of his elbow, providing a silent, tactile map of the world. He shook hands with the men who had once pitied him. Cora drank cider and traded recipes with the women who had once crossed the street to avoid her. The stigma of the Black Widow and the cripple had been burned away in the fire, replaced by the deep, unspoken respect the frontier reserves for those who refuse to be broken by it. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant, bruised purple, streaked with veins of gold and fiery orange. The townsfolk began to pack their wagons, shouting their final congratulations as they headed back down the trail to Oakhaven. Slowly, the shattered pine returned to quiet. But it was no longer a dead, heavy silence. It was a living, breathing quiet. The draft horse nickered in the new barn. The blue heeler pup barked playfully at a barn cat. The creek rushed steadily over the stones. Elias and Cora stood alone on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear over the ridge. Elias reached into the pocket of his suit jacket. His fingers pulled out a familiar object, the silver harmonica he hadn't touched since the night before the blizzard. He tapped it against his palm, feeling the cool metal. Then he raised it to his lips. He didn't play a mournful, lonely tune. He played a slow, sweet waltz. The notes drifted out over the prairie, warm and rich, filling the empty spaces between the stars that were just beginning to prick the darkening sky. Cora smiled. She stepped in front of him, gently placing her right hand on his waist and taking his left hand in hers. Elias lowered the harmonica, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "The music stopped, Mrs. Thorne," he whispered. "Then we don't need the music," Cora replied softly. She stepped backward, pulling him gently into the rhythm of a dance only they could hear. Elias didn't stumble. He moved with her, his large frame graceful and steady, completely attuned to the subtle shifts of her weight and the pressure of her hand. They danced on the porch of the home they had built from ashes. The wind rustled the pines, a soft applause from the wilderness that had tried to claim them. Elias pulled her closer, wrapping both arms securely around her waist, resting his scarred cheek against the top of her head. He couldn't see the stars. He couldn't see the mountains turning black against the night sky. But as he held the woman who had reached through his silence and pulled him back to life, Elias Thorne knew with absolute certainty that he would never walk in the dark again 7 years later. The silver harmonica caught the late afternoon sun, flashing like a beacon against the backdrop of the Wyoming plains. But the music spilling from it was no longer a lonely, mournful waltz played to an empty, freezing dark. It was a breathless, rollicking Texas two-step, fast and joyful, keeping time with the heavy, rhythmic tap of a leather boot against the pine floorboards of the porch. Elias Thorne sat in a wide, hand-carved rocking chair, his broad shoulders relaxed against the polished wood. 7 years had dusted his dark hair with silver at the temples, but time and peace had softened the brutal, defensive lines of his face. The jagged scar on his jaw remained, but it was no longer a monument to pain. It was simply a part of the man, weathered and familiar. He stopped playing suddenly, lowering the harmonica. His head tilted slightly toward the yard, his sightless eyes crinkling at the corners. He didn't need to see the dust kicking up near the corral. He could hear it. Crunch scuff. Crunch scuff. "You're dragging your left boot again, William," Elias called out, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the warm summer breeze. "Pick your feet up when you run, or you're going to eat the dirt." A loud, breathless giggle erupted from the yard. "I'm not running, Pa. I'm sneaking." "You sound like a spooked draft horse," Elias chuckled, leaning forward. He turned his head a fraction of an inch to the right. "And you, little bird, you think because you're in the grass I can't hear you?" A high-pitched squeal of delight pierced the air. "Get him!" a tiny voice shrieked. Two small bodies launched themselves onto the porch. Elias didn't even flinch. He dropped the harmonica into his shirt pocket and opened his massive, calloused arms just in time to catch the impact. 6-year-old William hit his chest first, solid and reckless, followed instantly by 4-year-old Sarah, who scrambled up his knee like a squirrel. Elias let out a booming laugh, wrapping his arms around both of them, burying his face in their sun-warmed hair. He knew the smell of them instantly. William smelled of saddle leather and crushed sagebrush, while Sarah carried the sweet, powdery scent of the wild clover she liked to hoard in her apron pockets. "Ambushed on my own porch," Elias groaned, feigning defeat as Sarah's small hands patted his cheeks. "I surrender." "We caught the outlaw," William cheered, wrestling with his father's thick arm. Inside the cabin, standing behind the wire mesh screen door, Cora Thorne wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and smiled. The shattered pine was no longer a place of survival. It was a sanctuary. Cora looked past her husband and children out over the sprawling acreage. The herd was over 300 strong now, grazing peacefully on the lush green ridges. The fences were immaculate, stretching for miles. The Deepwater Creek ran clear and cold, fully theirs, untainted by the greed of men like Silas Blackwood, a man whose empire had crumbled years ago under the weight of his own arrogance and the unified defiance of the Oakhaven townsfolk. Cora leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, a profound, heavy warmth settling in her chest. She remembered the freezing, desperate woman who had walked into the dance hall 7 years ago, clutching a single silver dollar. She remembered the sheer, terrifying void she had stepped into when she took the hand of a blind, broken cowboy. Now, there was no void. There was only light. Elias suddenly stopped wrestling. He held Sarah in the crook of one arm and rested his other hand on William's head. He turned his face directly toward the screen door. "You're going to burn the biscuits, Cora," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a knowing half-smile. "The stove is banked, Elias," Cora laughed softly, pushing the screen door open. "And you show off. How did you know I was standing there? I didn't make a sound." Elias stood up, setting Sarah gently on her feet. "I don't need to hear you step to know you're there, Mrs. Thorne. I can feel the shift in the air when you look at me." "Go check the barn for the new kittens," Cora told the children, swatting playfully at William's shoulder as he bolted past her. "Don't pick them up, just look." "Yes, Ma." And they chimed together, their footsteps fading rapidly toward the massive, sunlit barn. Cora walked across the porch, stopping exactly 2 feet in front of Elias. He didn't hesitate. His hands reached out, finding her waist with the practiced, flawless certainty of a man who knew her topography better than his own heartbeat. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around her back. Cora rested her hands flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm beneath his shirt. She looked up at his face, at the clouded, unseeing eyes that held her entire world. "It's a beautiful evening," Cora murmured, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "The sky is the color of wild honey, and the mountains are casting long purple shadows over the valley." Elias rested his chin on the crown of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. He closed his eyes, letting her words paint the horizon in his mind. He didn't miss the sunrises anymore. He didn't miss the sight of the snow on the peaks. He had everything he needed right here in his arms. "Dance with me," Elias whispered suddenly. Cora pulled back slightly, looking up at him in surprise. "There's no music playing." "I don't need a fiddle to know the steps." Elias didn't wait for her answer. He slid his right hand down to her waist and caught her calloused left hand in his. He stepped backward, pulling her smoothly into a slow, sweeping waltz across the weathered pine boards of the porch. Cora let out a soft, breathless laugh, following his lead. They moved perfectly together in the quiet of the golden hour, entirely in sync, guided by nothing but the rustle of the wind and the beating of their own hearts. As they turned at the edge of the porch, Cora looked at their joined hands. The scars on his knuckles matched the scars on hers. They were the hands of survivors. They were the hands of builders. Cora squeezed his fingers, her throat tightening with an overwhelming absolute grace. 7 years ago, a room full of people had looked at this man and seen a tragedy. They had seen a broken thing to be pitied, a shadow to be avoided. No one had danced with him. They had left him standing alone at the edge of the light, waiting in the dark. But Cora knew the truth. The dark hadn't broken Elias Thorne. It had only taught him how to hold on tight when the right hand finally reached through the silence. Elias pulled her close, burying his face in the crook of her neck as they swayed together on the porch of the home they had built from ashes. The frontier stretched out endlessly around them, wild and untamed. But within the walls of the shattered pine, the storm was over, and they would never walk alone again.